Taking the midnight train had become a routine for me. After late-night shifts at the hospital, it was the quickest way to get home. That particular night, the platform was almost deserted, except for a few souls likely heading home like me. The train arrived on time, and I quickly found a seat. Across from me sat a man in a business suit, clearly exhausted, probably coming from a late-night office gig. A few rows behind, a young woman whispered into her phone, trying not to draw attention. We were halfway through the journey when the train suddenly jolted and came to an abrupt stop. The lights remained on, but the usual hum of the moving train was replaced by silence, broken occasionally by the distant sound of the tracks settling. The businessman across me looked up, visibly irritated. "What now?" he muttered. The young woman ended her call and looked around, equally puzzled. After a few minutes of waiting, I decided to walk up to the front and find out what was happening. The businessman, introducing himself as Derek, joined me, seeking the same answers. As we approached the driver's cabin, we noticed the door was ajar. Peeking in, we found it empty. The controls were untouched and the driver's belongings were still there, but the driver himself was nowhere to be found. Derek frowned. "This doesn't make sense. Where could he have gone?" We decided to check the rest of the train. As we walked through the carriages, we came across the young woman who introduced herself as Mia. She was visibly shaken. "I saw someone," she whispered. When the train stopped, I looked out the window and I saw a figure running away. Derek and I exchanged glances. Who would stop a train in the middle of nowhere and then run off? Thinking quickly, Derek suggested, "We need to contact the authorities. There's an emergency intercom in the driver's cabin." We rushed back and after some fumbling managed to get the intercom working. The dispatcher on the other end sounded surprised. "Train 457, you're not due for another 30 minutes. We explained the situation and they promised to send help. In the meantime, they guided Derek to get the train moving slowly to the next station. Relief washed over us as we pulled into the next station, where police and railway officials awaited us. They took our statements and started their investigation. A few days later, the mystery unraveled. The driver had been involved in a smuggling ring, using the midnight train to transport illegal goods. That night, he'd been tipped off about a potential police search and had panicked, stopping the train and fleeing into the night. While the story had a logical conclusion, the experience changed my perspective forever. The midnight train, once a mundane part of my routine, now held an air of unpredictability. It was a chilling reminder that even the most routine parts of our lives could, in an instant, turn into stories we'd never forget. Late shifts were a norm for me at the newspaper agency. My job often had me chasing leads and stories till the wee hours. That night was no different. By the time I wrapped up and headed for the train station, it was close to midnight. The platform was nearly empty, save for a couple of night owls like me. I settled into a corner seat, looking forward to some quiet before reaching my stop. But as the train pulled out, I noticed him, a man sitting a few rows ahead, his face hidden by the brim of his hat, his coat unusually thick for the season. Now I've seen all sorts on the midnight train partygoers, late shift workers, insomniacs. But something about this man felt off. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing around or how he clutched his bag tightly. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to keep an eye on him. After a few stops, a woman boarded the train. She seemed tired, her eyes heavy with sleep. She took the seat right opposite the man. Almost immediately I noticed his demeanor change. His glances became more frequent, and he seemed to be watching her intently. Feeling a bit protective, I shifted to a seat closer to them. The woman, sensing something amiss, looked around nervously. Our eyes met, and I nodded subtly, hoping to convey that I was aware and watching out. As the stations passed, the train grew emptier. When we approached a particularly long stretch between stations, the man suddenly got up and moved next to the woman. She recoiled, but he whispered something to her, his hand diving inside his coat. My heart raced. I had to act. Pretending to stretch, I moved closer, trying to listen in. I could hear him murmuring threats, demanding she hand over her jewelry. So he was a robber. Without thinking, I shouted, "Hey, leave her alone!" The man whipped around, his face a mask of anger. In his hand was a small knife. "Mind your own business," he hissed. The woman used the distraction to push him away and darted towards the train door. The man lunged at her, but I managed to tackle him, the knife skittering away. We wrestled, punches thrown, each trying to overpower the other. The train began slowing, signaling an approaching station. Seizing an opportunity, I managed to shove him off me and sprinted towards the door with the woman. We rushed out as soon as the doors slid open, not stopping until we were safely out of the station. Breathing heavily, I asked the woman if she was okay. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there." We reported the incident to the station authorities, giving them a description of the man. The next day, I received a call from the police. Using the CCTV footage, they had identified the man as a known felon with a record of robberies and assaults. They were confident they'd catch him soon. Grateful for the heads up, I decided to change my routine, avoiding the midnight train for a while. The event served as a stark reminder of the unpredictable nature of life. You never know what's around the corner, even on a regular train ride home. The story soon became talk of the town, and I was hailed as a hero in the local newspapers. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about heroics. It was about being there for a fellow human in need. A few weeks later, I ran into the woman, her name was Clara, at a cafe. We struck up a conversation and over time became good friends. She often joked that while that night was the most terrifying of her life, it led her to one of her most valuable friendships. As for me, I realized that sometimes the most impactful stories aren't the ones I write for the newspaper. They are the ones I live. Riding the midnight train had always been a part of my routine, given my late work hours. However, that night was different. The atmosphere felt heavier, and a cold, biting wind swept through the platform despite it being indoors. I quickly boarded the train, looking for a warm corner. To my surprise, the usually bustling midnight carriage was almost deserted. Just a few passengers were scattered here and there, most of them lost in thought or trying to catch a nap. A few minutes into the journey, I began hearing faint whispers. Thinking it was someone's headphones playing too loud, I looked around. No one seemed to be using any devices. I tried dismissing it, blaming it on my tired mind playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, morphing into audible murmurs. The train suddenly halted at a station that wasn't on the route. Morwick. I'd never heard of it, and it looked ancient, with cracked wooden benches and faded signs. The entire station was enveloped in a thick fog, and the lighting was dim, casting eerie shadows everywhere. It was then I saw her, a pale young girl in a white dress, standing at the edge of the platform, staring directly at me. Her eyes were hollow and her face expressionless. I was frozen in place, a chill running down my spine. The murmurs grew louder, turning into desperate cries. They seemed to echo from every direction, and I could make out words. "Help us. Don't go. Stay away." Panicking, I decided to leave the train, but as I reached the door, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The lights in the carriage began to flicker, and the temperature dropped drastically. Every breath I took formed a mist in front of me. The little girl began to approach the train, her steps silent. With every step, the whispers grew louder and more frantic. I backed away, desperately trying to pry open the doors on the other side. Suddenly, a hand gripped my shoulder. I turned to find an old woman, her face etched with concern. "Close your eyes and don't listen to them," she whispered. Without waiting for my response, she began humming a soft lullaby. Somehow her voice managed to drown out the whispers. I closed my eyes tightly, clutching the seat, trying to focus only on her voice. It felt like hours, but in reality it was probably only a few minutes. When I finally dared to open my eyes, the train was moving again. The old woman was gone. I looked around and everything seemed normal. The passengers were still in their seats, oblivious to what had just transpired. Confused and terrified, I waited for my stop, rushed home, and locked all the doors. The next day, curiosity got the better of me and I decided to research Morwick. To my horror, I discovered that Morwick was a town that existed over a century ago. It was wiped out overnight due to a massive landslide. The railway track was built over the remains and Morwick Station was left abandoned. There were numerous reports of sightings and unexplained phenomena, especially on the midnight train. Did I encounter the lost souls of Morwick? Or was it just my tired mind playing tricks? I'll never know for sure, but one thing was certain, I never took the midnight train again.